Good morning, guys.
Aloha.
Good morning.
Are you feeling energized and awake and caffeinated?
Yes, we are.
Okay, excellent. Good. Thank you for being here. You know, AI is bandied about so much. It's in our pages all the time in the magazine and in our website. But I feel like we use the term all the time without actually talking about what it really means, you know? Because to me, it's a really great NBA point guard with a killer crossover. So what is artificial intelligence to you before we get going? Do you want to start, Dario?
Well, I mean, one way to look at it is like AI obviously is a scientific and academic discipline that has been with us since the 1950s. So it's had a long arc, and in its pursuit essentially is a pursuit of mimicking and reproducing aspects of human intelligence by means of computers. And there's been sort of two long arcs, I think, within that. One has been the task of getting machines to learn. And there's been also another intellectual tradition in the field of AI that has to do with like knowledge representation and be able to do symbolic manipulation. And those have been two long arcs of multi-decade journey of trying to mimic aspects of human intelligence in computers.
Yeah, maybe riffing on that a little bit, when you want to define AI, it's good to define human intelligence. What makes us intelligent? And there are some basic things, like we can have motor control, which translates to robotics and getting robots to move around in the physical world. We have visual understanding of the world, which translates to computer vision, trying to identify company logos or different stages of breast cancer and radiology images. And we have natural language processing, which I think is the most interesting manifestation of human intelligence, namely that we can communicate with one another in really complex ways. And so those are three of the main application areas that then translate into a lot of business applications. And then there are a couple of things that humans can't do that AI is also trying to do, like trying to understand genes and whole long gene sequences that humans couldn't even handle because we're not really evolved to do that. And so pretty broad set of applications in AI.
Thank you, guys. I took a quick browse at news headlines about AI lately, and this is what it was promising, right? It was faster drug development, more effective policing, smarter military vehicles, lower dentist bills. I'm kind of curious about that one. Of course, great Spotify playlists, as we learned last night. But there were also a lot of terrible things that AI was promising, right? Videos of politicians saying things they've never said. Nude images of women that were never taken. Nimbler cyber criminals. Systemic discrimination against minority populations. So how do we get the best of artificial intelligence, the best of artificial human intelligence without the worst of humanity? Richard?
Yeah, it's a really good question. AI is not just dual use, but omni-use technology. In the end, we don't say, oh, what about computers? They can be used for good and bad. Yeah, computers can be used for anything. And like, it gets even simpler, like a hammer. You can use a hammer to build a house. You can use a hammer to hurt people. You can use the internet to do great things. You can use cars to do, AI will be everywhere. Every single industry will be impacted by AI. And in the end, it's up to us to define what tasks we want it to do. And then when we define those tasks, we also need to think about the data sets. AI, in the end, is only as good as the training data that we give it. And humans have to think carefully about ethics. And I think the field of AI has now woken up to that. In 2010, when I got started with deep learning and other kinds of neural network algorithms, they hadn't really worked that well yet, and they weren't in every application in agriculture and medicine and everything else. And so the field hadn't thought about AI ethics as much. But now we've really come to reckoning, I think, a lot of different companies in academia also, and are thinking about the ethical implications of the technology. But the AI ethics, it's a very smooth transition to general software and technology ethics, more general ethics, period, and legal, political, and cultural. And so you see the smooth transition where you have, for instance, very large freedom of speech culture in the United States. So AI recommendation engines don't care if something is true or not. They will just recommend it to you, and before you know it, you have filter bubbles. So
I have noticed.
It's a complex situation, yeah.
Dario, what do you think? I mean, you both work for very large tech companies, right? You're the chief scientist of Salesforce. You run IBM Research. What is your responsibility in this regard?
Well, one of the things, in some ways, AI is an unfortunate term because we've ended up transferring too much human agency to this term. And what I mean by that is like, you can read, when you're having like those headlines, it can give the impression that AI is this sort of autonomous thing that is acting on the world and performing both the good and the bad things as if it was happening on its own. And just one thought experiment, just substitute the word AI with software for a second. And imagine rereading those very same headlines that says software does this, software does that. The immediate reaction that we would say is to say, well, software doesn't do this or that. Like, who created that? Who has the responsibility for putting this out? But somehow, when we use the word AI, it creates this distance, and it feels like it's acting on its own. So I think one of the ways that we got to address this is to put the responsibility back to who is creating this software, and what is their purpose, and what is their intent, and the accountability needs to rest with the people and the institutions that are creating this software. And we should really avoid the tendency to say, as if AI as an external agency was doing this on its own.
Right. Richard, I want to come back to deepfakes. Deepfakes is the term for the videos of politicians saying things that they didn't say, among many other things. You've actually spoken on this topic a little bit. You said this was overhyped. It's been in the news an awful lot this year. Why is it overhyped from a researcher's perspective?
So deepfakes, just to define, basically with deep learning, you can make people say things they never said before. And in some ways, it's just an automated way to create special effects. And people have faked photography and videos for a long time. And people have gotten better and better at realizing, these 5 missiles flying at the same time are actually 1 missile flying once and then just being photoshopped 5 times into one another. And people have gotten better at identifying photoshopped pictures and started to become more skeptical of fake photos and stage photos or crop photos and things like that. And I think we will have to come to a similar understanding when it comes to videos of people being in one frame that already can tell you something. If the face doesn't move very much and moves along the video, you will notice, oh, it's probably less likely to be completely real, being able to create different angles for the same person while they're speaking. So people will, I think, adapt to that quickly, but I'm much more worried about people creating fake news and then people sharing it on social media and then AI recommending those things. And when there was AI in the loop there in the recommendation engine, but not in the creation. People are very good at creating fake news. You can write fake news too. Normal people can do that. And people found that this is a reasonable way to make money. When you live in Bulgaria and you can just create something outrageous, then people will click it in certain online social networks and so on. Those are bigger concerns for me. It is still quite hard to create really convincing videos that are fake. But in the end, everybody can Photoshop stuff already.
Yeah, so you're worried about it training the system in the wrong way is your chief concern. Dario, let's talk about something we can control then, bias. Mm-hmm. So both of you have spoken about this, and your organization actually put something out. IBM Research said that biased AI is on the rise, but unbiased AI will win. Why?
Well, the way we look at bias is under the umbrella of trusted AI. So one perspective to look at it, imagine a set of concentric circles, where at the inner circle you have all the core AI algorithms that the community is creating. And just to give a perspective of it, I think last year there were 36,000 scientific publications in the field of AI. So it's an enormous, dynamic field where these advances are happening. But now you're in a business or an institution and you have this task of bringing those innovations and say, how do I deploy it at scale? So what do you have to do? So we believe strongly that the second layer that you got to put around it is a trusted layer. And that has a component of, in many regulated industries and in many contexts with professionals, you got to give some aspect of explainability or what is happening behind these recommended models as an example. Fairness, as an example, if we look in the context, say, of banking, and you're trying to build a predictive model to be able to assign credit, as an example, is based on learning from past examples. So if you just naively went and you say, well, what credit approvals have we done over the last 20, 30 years, and let me use the approvals that were generated as a means to train this model, well, what would happen most likely is that you'll end up with a model that is likely to give more credit to men than to women. And that's not necessarily that the neural network is biased, it's the data sets that were done were biased. So a way to compensate for that issue is you gotta have robust AI engineering methodologies to be able to test for unwanted bias. And particularly, for example, if you have protected variables that are protected by law, that you cannot use as a means to do discrimination from the perspective of assigning classes, you just have to be able to detect that. So we believe explainability, fairness, robustness, some of these AI models are subject to adversarial attacks, and you gotta have software to be able to test it. And the last component of trust that we've defined is what we call lineage, meaning you gotta have a historical record of how predictions were generated. If a regulator later comes in the context say, of banking, and 2 years later you say, what did you make that credit decision on May 16, 2018? You can't just say, well, I don't have the track of the data and the model how it was generated. So you need these 4 components to generate trust in models. And from there, you can then go and deploy it and scale, integrating into applications.
Yeah, I want to get your opinion in 1 second, but I just want to let you know I'm going to come to you for questions in just a moment, so please ready them. Go ahead.
I'm glad you asked about bias, because I think it is going to be one of the fundamental issues of AI in the future. I think you mentioned all the right things. Maybe just a few things to add. One is there's also a sort of higher level bias in who is working on AI and how diverse that set of people is. We're unfortunately not a good example here on stage, but basically it's a lot of white men. And we're trying to improve that. So next month I'll go to Deep Learning in Daba. It's a workshop on deep learning in Kenya. And we're trying to actively improve that aspect, because in the end, if you have people who work in agricultural communities, then they might be more likely to think about really positive AI applications for agriculture. And if you work in Silicon Valley and you talk to Fortune 500 companies, you might be less inclined to think about those kinds of problems. But again, AI can impact anything, and it's just a matter of choosing the right kinds of problems that you want to work on. So we also have like an AI for Good group that works on medical applications or counting sharks on the California coast. And these are all applications that AI can do as well. And then there's maybe one silver lining on the bias question, and that is, let's say you have these credit assigning algorithms or promotion algorithms in large supermarket chain, and maybe you have 1,000 store managers who say, oh, I'm not sexist, but this woman was just not very qualified. It's easy for one person to give an excuse, but once you distill all of their decisions over a decade into one algorithm, it's very clear. AI sometimes puts a mirror in front of our faces and tells us, this is what you have been doing all this time. And then in the end, it's actually easier to solve one algorithm than it is to convince 1,000 different people to change their minds about some issue they might not even acknowledge. So I'm also in the end, long-term, very optimistic about the technology.
That comment on a mirror into ourselves, I couldn't agree more. And it really is back to this, what I was alluding before about agency, is we would naturally go and say, well, the AI was biased, that was created, and when we actually understand that it's a mirror into our own institutions, we should bring back the responsibility to our own institutions, and you say, well, actually, AI helped us understand what we were actually doing, and now what do we have to do to change, which is not just an algorithmic thing. It may be much more profound of what we need to change inside our own houses to be able to fix the issue that AI, in this case, has identified.
Yeah, what we can see could be uncomfortable. All right, let's go to questions. Questions, please, raise your hands. There are mic runners. Yes, we've got one right here. Wait for the mic if you don't mind, sir. Could you raise your hand again just so they can find you? Thank you. And of course, your name and who you're with.
Thank you. Sunny Munchani from Protegrity. So this question of bias is a little confusing to me. It is relatively easy to remove bias by having possibilistic occurrences in some sort of a membership function set, like a fuzzy set, instead of probabilistic occurrences. And it's so easy to remove. Why is it such a big deal?
It's actually not as easy to remove as you'd think. So for instance, you say, oh, we have a protected column of race. And here are the people with that setting in the database, or maybe their gender, or whatever it is. But in the end, there are a lot of confounding factors that are highly correlated with that. So in the US, you have a lot of very segregated cities. You had redlining kinds of practices by banks done before. And so with knowing somebody's income and knowing somebody's zip code, boom, you're also in some cities with 99.9% accuracy can predict their race. And now you have to, it's a fine balance. There's no silver bullet. So in the case of Salesforce, we're a platform company, right? So we don't just build one app and need to make sure this one app doesn't have a bias we don't want in it. We have a platform, we have 150,000 different organizations. They all want to build their own AI systems on our platform. And maybe somebody is trying to market breast milk, and it just really is okay to not market it to men. They probably don't need it. Or like, you know, a breast pump or something like that. That is a very specific product. And so it's really tricky to know which things are protected and what kinds of cases. And then there sort of data and label leakage that you might have where you have different categories that aren't particularly, you know, defined as protected, like zip code. Nobody usually thinks about that, but before you know it, it can sort of seep into that, and the bias can seep into that. So it is actually a pretty tricky issue. There are some ways to solve it technically, some you mentioned, and there are many others for specific applications, but in the end, there has to be a mindset. There's no silver bullet, and for this kind of problem.
Isn't that the magic of learning systems?
It's the magic of learning systems, but the learning systems, again, are only as good as the training data that they get.
Yeah, so just one addition to that, even on fairness itself, there are just so many different metrics that the community has developed. When we release a Fairness 360, an open toolkit, we think we have over 22 different fairness metrics that the scientific community has developed, you know, not just in the field of AI, of course, over time. So you have to test across many, many different dimensions. And yeah, I couldn't agree more that actually, you know, the fact that variables are correlated to one another in hidden ways makes the problem actually quite sophisticated.
Yeah. All right. Next question, please. Just raise your hand. Oh, they're afraid. The coffee hasn't kicked in. Oh, yes. Yes, we've got one right up here. Could you keep your hand raised, please, so they can find you? Yes, thank you. And please introduce yourself.
Yeah, Rick Chavey with Enterworks, CEO. You tend to think about AI as being something that a company does to their consumers or customers on their behalf. What about the other way around of thinking of it as a C2B kind of play where I get to have AI to go out there and distill among all the things that are threats or opportunities for me, and I control my data, I control my little AI bot going out there? Is there something you think about in that realm as well?
I love that. I love that idea, and that's, again, why I'm so excited to be at Salesforce, where we enable a lot of companies, even small and medium-sized companies, as long as they have the kinds of data required, to create their own AI. And I think that will be very empowering. In the end, of course, a lot of companies in the non-B2B world make money off of the data, and then it's a free kind of setup. Of course, in the enterprise world, you know, Salesforce trust is our #1 value, so there's no data sharing, and in some cases that is really important. So for instance, we have a lot of speech recognition. We just released Einstein Voice Assistant, where you can, for instance, just walk out of a meeting and dictate all the things you want to have your CRM be updated with. And that is takes out a big pain point. Nobody likes data entry into CMs. And being able to automatically do that with just your voice and then the natural language processing underneath and connecting it to the database is a big improvement, and everybody has essentially their own assistant. So that does empower people, and when they use it, the more they use it, the smarter it will get for their application. But we've noticed in some cases that banks, for instance, don't want to use it if we use a consumer speech recognition system because they're worried that data will leak into that. And then one of the interesting sort of tidbits of that is as you train these speech recognition systems, they learn to autocomplete. Right? If you say, what is the price of wood? Wood sounds similar to would I want to go there? And so which wood it is it W-O-U-L-D or W-O-O-D? Depends on the context. And so you autocomplete things, and if a bank uses it, then they talk about some secret acquisition, and you say company X acquires company mumble, and then it has seen that from a bank in a consumer way where your data is shared in a large global model, it might autocomplete it to secret information. And so in some cases, banks in particular and other regulated industries really want to make sure it's their own AI and it's not shared with anybody else.
I think that aspect of your own AI is also a very big trend that of what has happened in the last 3 to 4 years. I mean, if you look at in the field 5 years ago or so on, it was just mostly the realm of relatively few large players, and of course specialized startups that were in there. Now you go, and back to the AIs like software, you can go to any financial institution, insurance companies, healthcare companies, automotive, and they want to be co-participants and co-creators of AI. So a trend that has happened has been to democratize and give tools to people so that they can create their AI efficiently, and how you debug it, and how do you create AI engineering as a discipline, just like we have done in the past with software engineering, right? And we will create a program and debug it and so on. We need all of that tooling to allow everybody to also co-create and integrate with each other.
Gentlemen, AI is an automating factor, and I'd like to ask you, there's the saying that technology neither creates nor destroys jobs, just reallocates them, But tell that to somebody who's just lost their job. So I realize this is slightly outside of your jurisdiction, but how do you feel about the automating effect on the modern corporation as it pertains to AI? How are you thinking about that? Because I think that's what there's a lot of anxiety about.
It's a really tough issue. It is something that we do think about. I think it's sort of the macroeconomic impact of AI. I think long term, I'm very optimistic. I think if you ask people now, 150 years ago, over 90% of people worked in agriculture. So if you ask people now, would 90% of this room want to go and work in the field every day by hand before tractors came along? And most people would say no. If you ask somebody 150 years ago, is there anything else you want to do other than create food? They're like, what else would I do? I already have a house. This is all we need to do. So it's hard for us to be that creative, to think too far ahead. Another example I like to think about is like the internet. 40 years ago, the first sort of ARPANET, TCP IP packages were sent around, and you ask the experts of networking, what's the impact on jobs going to be in 40 years? 0 of the experts predicted that the ARPANET will lead to a Twitter social media marketing manager position. And AI will have an even bigger impact than the internet had, and so it's impossible for us to think that far ahead and predict all the interesting and fun kinds of jobs that will be around. But one thing is clear to me, it'll require a lot more empathy, human connection, and creativity, because everything that feels kind of repetitive in your job will probably get automated.
And purpose, right? I mean, I don't think we should become technological determinists. I think in the end, we have society and institutions, and in the context of the United States, a democratic set of institutions that allows us to govern and to choose how we want to live, and how do we use tools, and technology in the end is a tool. I think we can have a tendency to say, well, because this is possible, you'll dictate what needs to happen. And I think we got to devolve and have again, power back to all of us to choose what kind of future we want. On the positive side as well, what I would say is we haven't run out of problems to solve in the world. There's a lot of issues that we got to address. And fundamentally, we're limited sometimes by our ability to understand a very sophisticated and complex world. And to the extent that we can create tools that are companions to all of us, to extend our cognition, to really be able to help us understand and solve problems in the world, that's a very positive thing. And I'm going to say not just positive. I think it's indispensable to deal with the complexity of the world that we have created.
Well said. This was a fascinating panel. Please, a round of applause for Dario and Richard. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everybody.